Good morning, everyone. My name is Quinn Casal. I'm the Vice President of Transport Chicago 2025. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Hope we're off to a good start so far. Sure. So there's a lot of transit-related topics being discussed at our conference today. Rightly so. I work at CTA. No bias, but the fiscal cliff is probably the most important, the most pressing issue we face in the future of transit and that entire discussion. If you're in this room, you most likely already know that. And we were sort of putting together the proposals for this year, opening the selections, and who wanted to present on which topics. We knew we had to do something about the fiscal cliff, but in February, it was a very different story. We didn't know what was going to happen. How do you shape content around something like that, right? So what we have done as an exec board and a steering committee was sort of combine various proposals we had about the fiscal cliff into sort of one panel that's being moderated by CMAP here. I'll introduce all of our speakers, but we knew we had to, have one session that could really react to the dynamic nature of this issue. And as you saw a couple weeks ago, the story is quite different than it was before that. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but we're here to talk about, what's going on with the fiscal cliff is the name of the session, but we're also going to talk about what happened so far and what does it mean? What's good, what's bad, what's in the legislation? Like, we're all kind of picking up information as we go, right? So without much further ado, I will introduce our panel. We have Elizabeth Scott, Principal Policy Analyst with CMAP, who will be moderating our all-star panel here. We have Kate Lowe, Assistant Professor at UIC. Maulik, Vaishnav, Senior Deputy Executive Director of Planning and Capital Programming at the RTA. Audrey, Wennink, Senior Director of Transportation at Metropolitan Planning Council. And Francis Orenic with Illinois AFL-CIO. So I will get out of the way and have a really robust discussion. We'll be welcoming your questions as well towards the end. So have at it, Elizabeth.
Quinn.
Thank you.
As Quinn said, my name is Elizabeth Scott. I'm a principal at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and I'm very proud to have been, along with my colleague Daniel Como, sitting right in front of me, one of the leaders of CMAP's efforts to develop the plan of action for regional transit, which is, I think, why they thought I could be allowed to moderate this session. I have been looking forward to this so much because the Transport Chicago group and family is full of people who really care about these issues. And I think the future of transit is on the top of everyone's mind. So I credit the Transport Chicago organizers with bringing together this diverse panel. I was saying before we got started that we all disagree about at least one thing, which hopefully makes a good panel, good discussion, because productive discussion among people who are passionate about transit and care about its future is good and it's healthy and it's going to be what we need to move from where we're at right now, which is a major existential crisis, to a place of solution and bringing about the future that we all want. Because I think we've been talking to people in the region literally for years now about this. And there is broad agreement that we want a safe, attractive, efficient, useful system that does everything that we need economically and for our climate. And people are united on this. People are united on the fact that they want more service and they can see how transit could be better in the future, but it's more about safeguarding it in the current moment against its current threats and thinking about how we shape the path from here to that better future we all want. So just to give you a little context of what everybody's bringing to the panel, Maulik is a senior person at the RTA, but he also previously worked at CTA. Francis Orenic from AFL-CIO is also a member of the Labor Alliance for Public Transportation, the coalition that introduced the United We Move bill in Springfield, one of the governance models for transit proposed. We have Audrey Wennink from MPC, but also the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, which introduced the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act legislation. And between those two bills, it kind of shaped the conversation that just concluded in May in Springfield. So we want to talk to you about that. And then, of course, we have Dr. Kate Lowe, general woman about town on transportation issues, and a good thinker to help push us on, I think, issues of equity and give an academic perspective. So, also, I will note that the Transport Chicago organizers named this panel. We did not name ourselves thought leaders. So just so you know, but we hope to have candid, interesting, not unbiased, forward-looking conversation today. But I also want to acknowledge how many transit employees are probably in the room right now, and just say that everybody is working as hard as they possibly can to solve these problems. And so when we talk about the challenges in front of us and disagreements about how we solve them, it's not about denigrating anybody's work. It's about how we can work together and to shape the future that we want. And I'm sure I speak for the panel when I say, and Maulik is a transit employee, that how grateful we are for everyone's work in the midst of the crisis. So I'm gonna kick it off. So Audrey, what happened in Springfield?
Okay, I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of the last week of session in Springfield, which I had never experienced in person before. And just a side note, I moved to Chicago from Washington, D.C. because I did not want to work in politics. And that was a long time ago, and I did not fully appreciate the politics integrated into urban planning and transportation planning, but here we are. So as Elizabeth said, there were two bills that had been introduced, the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act and the labor bill. And there were negotiations that occurred to determine how we could get together on an agreed bill, agreed language. So, as a preface to the last week, labor unions, the Labor Coalition and the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, as well as the legislative champions, including Senator Villavelam, Representative Evadina Delgado, Representative Cam Buckner, Representative Marcus Evans, as well as the governor's office, convened negotiations to get to agreed language. The last week, however, we were looking at pieces of legislation, individual sections over a course of maybe 4 weeks. We did not see all those pieces together until Wednesday of the last week of session. So we were anxiously awaiting the bill, like you all were, because we knew there were pieces probably in there we hadn't seen yet. So I'm talking about the days leading up to Saturday, May 31st, which is the last day of session. So that Wednesday, the House of Representatives released a bill in the morning that included the agreed upon governance and policy language, but it did not include any revenue. Wednesday night, the Senate introduced another bill which had almost identical policy and governance language, but also had funding. Thursday morning, the Senate held a subject matter hearing about the Senate bill. The Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, multiple people, myself included, testified in support of the bill at that hearing. The Labor Coalition testified in opposition to the bill at that hearing because of one of the funding sources, which was a transit fee on tollway transactions. Therefore, the legislators needed to regroup on the funding source, and they worked over the next 2 days and introduced a new bill with a different funding source at 5 p.m. on Saturday, May 31st, which is very late. That evening at 7:30 p.m., there was another Senate hearing where there was testimony, both for and against the bill, but the coalitions were for it at that point. And then now remember, on Saturday, May 31st, the state budget dropped that day too. So that was incredibly major and had to be dealt with by the legislators as well. So after the 7:30 p.m. subject matter hearing, the legislators convened in full on the floor. So the Senate and House went to the floor to take floor votes on the budget and also any bills that were still alive. And the budget had to go first. So there was a budget discussion, and it's usually a fairly spirited conversation if you watched any of it. And then there was a vote on that. But then it was getting very late in the evening, and then the Senate called the transit bill, which was actually HB 3438, at 11:45 p.m. And the Senate voted on it, and they voted in favor of the bill. But the session ends at midnight. Then the terms change in terms of voting thresholds, and that bill could not go to the House. There was not time for debate and vote in the House, so therefore it only passed the Senate, and therefore it's not fully passed. So that was the exciting week, the last week of May. That's not that long ago. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was my anniversary, and I made my partner watch the stream from the Capitol with me.
Oh, same. Watched it till 1 a.m. with my husband, yes.
Yeah, everyone goes to work together. The whole family goes to work, I guess. So I want to start with areas of consensus. Although the reforms did not pass, there seemed to be really meaningful consensus on some policies that were negotiated over the course of the last months to strengthen transit coordination and oversight in the region. I think that, before we get into the fiscal cliff challenge specifically, I'd like to just spend one question talking about things that you thought were promising, you liked, you didn't like, or, some areas where we can point out progress. So take it away.
Sure, I can start. I'll say that RTA had also released Transforming Transit. We had drafted language we put out, and as Audrey was describing the process, on the transit agency side, all 4 agencies were actively commenting back to Springfield about things that in the language were unimplementable. Like you can draft language, but then it has to work for the agencies that have to implement them, regardless of whatever you want to call us. We'll still have to implement the bill if it had passed both chambers. So that was going on. But as part of that, we were able to get a big change that I just want to focus on. One, in the interest of time, is that if you know the Act intimately, the way the funding structure is set up is that there are a bunch of formulas that divvy up funding between CTA, Metro, and PACE in different historical structural ways that are divided by geography, city versus suburbs versus collars. We were able to get a NTD performance data-driven split of funding in there for out years. We hold everyone harmless, but in the future, the funding would start to get split based on some of these measures, then eventually based on what we call service standards, but what type of services are being provided. That's a big policy shift. Unfortunately, to be the wet blanket, it doesn't matter if the funding doesn't pass, right? So I'll just mention that before passing it on to Francis.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Audrey, so much for that recap of legislative session. Being in the Capitol until the very end was, it was a long night. But so I wanted to kind of preface by saying that the Labor Alliance for Public Transportation is a coalition of about 15,000 union members represented by about 31 unions working within CTA, Metro, and PACE. And so at the very beginning, we kind of came into this with the perspective of, we're representing workers and riders and want to ensure that whatever changes made, especially on the reforms front, have the worker experience in mind. And obviously, as well, ensuring that we have, dedicated sustainable revenue for the transit system. So with some of the reforms that we found incredibly promising, one of the biggest priorities of many of our operators was around safety. Especially since the pandemic. I think we're all well aware about the rider experience, and that's also the worker experience, especially on the CTA, driving buses and trains. And so there's some very promising measures in this bill largely negotiated to ensure that we're keeping all different perspectives in mind when implementing them, but create the creation of a transit ambassador program to ensure that we're helping riders get through the system. And this is, Audrey and I went through weeks of discussions on this. And then also ensuring that there will be a task force led by the Cook County Sheriff's Office to deploy officers in a strategic way on public transit, addressing the immediate need for safety concerns, and then strategically working through what a police presence or a law enforcement presence and with community engagement will look like on public transit in the future. We also had many discussions on the topic of safety. Labor went into that as a massive priority for this bill and these negotiations, and so we were very pleased when we got to agreement with that outcome. I also just want to note that there was a lot of discussion around, especially with the original introduction of the two bills, ensuring that collective bargaining agreements remained intact throughout this entire process. And I think we're at a place where we're comfortable that the lives of the workers that we represent and their contracts will remain intact through these reforms.
Yeah, so one of the biggest changes here is that all the responsibilities for planning are now will be handled by the newly named Northern Illinois Transportation Authority, and that there will be full integration of that planning at the regional level. There also, while we will retain the service boards, as Francis noted, I'm not sure if you have noticed that in the board structure, there would be overlap of some of the board members. So a number of the board members that sit on the NEDA board would also serve as PACE board members, Metro board members, or CTA board members. So that will provide a lot of continuity in terms of planning in the region and everyone having a regional perspective. I'll also note a couple other exciting things. There is language about IDOT, which, IDOT has a large role in transit, even though I think it hasn't fully embraced that role as much as it can. And there is going to be a Transit Integration Policy Development Committee that will look at the barriers to advancing transit and prioritizing transit on roadways. There will be a new position, a Transit Coordination Oversight Officer named, who will help implement the policy recommendations made by that committee. And then my last point will be about transit-oriented development. There's establishment of transit-oriented, transit-supportive development functions, and this would strengthen the authority by NEDA to actually conduct joint development and actually own and develop transit-oriented development for non-specifically transportation purposes. That authority needed to be strengthened. There will be an inventory developed of public land near transit. There is a transit incentive fund created, although the funding is not identified. But there's lots of good stuff. I'll pass it over to Kate.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the bad stuff because or what I perceive as weaknesses, and then I'm going to end with the good stuff because it's more fun to end on positive notes. So prefacing that, I will say that the overlapping board members is a really intriguing innovation, but I have some major concerns about the board structure that was in the compromise bill, differing a lot from the United We Move bill, and just want to flag Cranes. Don't agree with their editorials, but they have great coverage. They mentioned that it will weaken the role of the city. And this is not about fighting city versus suburbs. This is about ensuring the perspectives of riders make it into board decisions. And the the negotiated language will significantly weaken the role of the CTA and underrepresent city residents and riders. And this is a larger pattern. This is not the first time we see urbanized residents underrepresented. Thomas Sanchez has studied metropolitan planning organizations. Urbanized residents are underrepresented in regional governance. We know the Illinois State Senate underrepresents cities. So it's part of a larger pattern, and we obviously need to work together for coordination and cooperation. And yes, Cook County should have a voice in the CTA as it's part of the CTA service areas. But I have strong equity concerns about the representation of where ridership is concentrated. Moving to some amazing things that I want to just acknowledge have taken a tremendous amount of effort by folks on the stage, in the audience, and across the area. Francis already mentioned transit ambassadors, but I'm really excited to see such consensus around that. Two other innovations that I wouldn't be surprised if Audrey had something to do with, fare capping and removal of parking mandates surrounding transit. So I think those are really exciting innovations in the compromise bill.
Thanks, you all. So turning to the fiscal cliff, the full topic of the presentation, I think it's going to be really important. Important to start, I guess, with some maybe myth busting or just ground setting about where we're at and what is going to happen next. Given that the General Assembly did not pass a transit bill in May, people in the region, people here at Transport Chicago have questions and are concerned about the impact to transit service. What does what happened mean for transit as we approach the fiscal cliff without a legislative solution? So let's start with Maulik. What's going to happen?
Oh boy. When we were called thought leaders, I just said we have a lot of thoughts. I wouldn't consider that leadership, but I'll be quick. I'm sure all of you tuned into our 3.5-hour board meeting yesterday. It's so exciting. So I'm just going to repeat those things for you. But it's getting really serious. I'll stop joking at some point. But 2025 is funded, right? Like we have a funded transit budget with several $100 million of federal relief money available for operations. So for the rest of the year, and as Francis will talk about the labor perspective, the service board, CTA, Metro, and PACE negotiate service with unions and with, in Metro's case, even with the freight railroads well in advance. So you will see potential even increases in service because that's the direction we were headed in, right? Like 2025 service plans are out. CT is just adding service on 53 and a couple of routes they talked about yesterday. All of that is at risk in 2026. So I think that's important to understand because on May 31st or June 1st, there was a little bit of, to Elizabeth's point, myth busting or myths out there that we needed to bust that, right now, service on the ground that you are seeing is continuing. We already have a deficit of operators. We want more people to work in transit, provide transit to us. So deeply thankful to labor that you stood your ground on funding on May 31st, that it would have, in my opinion, a worse outcome to have passed reform with $0 through both chambers. We need to get the funding done. So we laid out our budget call, which happens every year. We delayed it a month. We're asking CTA, Metro, and PACE to work with us on two scenarios in the budget. One is, because we have to balance the 2026 budget statutorily, regardless of whatever happens between now and December, January next year. And we can only provide by September 15th the public funding that we know is guaranteed. We can't use the numbers that are in the Senate bill because it didn't pass the House, so we can't do that. So there will be a massive gap of funding in 2026. And service boards have their own boards. They have to talk to them. They have to do their process, work with us. So you will see the 2026 budget with a scenario of what that service cut exactly looks like, what other measures we are taking to cut costs, and how it will be implemented on whatever schedule based on how much federal funding is left over. But as part of that, every year this happens. There's just a microscope on us right now. that everyone's paying attention, but it happens every year. We have to work with Moody's and other folks to re-estimate sales tax and other things. And there are sort of some little positive shifts. For example, the state is allowing more online sales to be taxed with the RTA tax. So we will incorporate all of those numbers in. We are asking for a fair increase in 26. So we have laid out this requirement of the service boards, and now we'll start working with them to come up with that terrible scenario. On the other hand, there's conversation out of our specific control to bring people back for a special session potentially in the summer, depending on other situations, especially the federal budget situation. So if they do come back sooner, and if we have certainty, hopefully before September 15th, or at least before the first week of October, when the first service board's budget is publicly dropping, we have opportunities to sort of potentially see guaranteed revenues. And I'll talk about that in another question of a couple of things that can come in sooner. But frankly, the damage is already done. We have to go down this planning path and waste a lot of our time and resources on things that are way less exciting than they would have been in the direction of providing riders better service. But that second scenario is how to potentially avoid the trigger of the service cuts, warn notices, all the terrible things that would come with it, if a stopgap or another solution, a full bill is able to be passed sooner than later. There will be some revenues in there, especially new ones, that cannot be activated right away. So there'll be a cash crunch, and a lot of that we can talk about. But that's the exact process that will happen between now and October. And then the public hearings and other things will happen as part of the budget process. So I'll stop there, but there's a lot to figure out, and we are being asked to be nimble by our board, and so we'll try to incorporate this murky situation as much as possible, and our goal is to avoid harm to riders and workers at the end of the day, but that does require funding sources to pass both House and the Senate.
To offer a perspective on what this means for transit employees and workers in the system, obviously the impact will be devastating. I think I mentioned earlier that we have at least 15,000 workers, union workers in the system, and we've heard that through the RTA and through potential cuts that 3,000 jobs at least are at risk. We understand through other conversations that those layoff notices will start coming in late August, early September. The impact on workers right now is already being felt. There was an incredible Tribune article out earlier this week really highlighting that kind of human impact of what this fiscal cliff means. Workers are canceling summer vacations, are not sure if they're going to be able to pay for their children to get school supplies in the fall because of this uncertainty. And I want to highlight the fact that transit workers are also massive figments in our communities. You're not just harming the one of those 3,000 workers. That impact ripples through our communities, and I think will ripple through the Chicagoland region a lot more than we're probably anticipating right now. So from a labor perspective, we are obviously very concerned for the members that will be directly impacted, but also indirectly impacted. There's, I think over 500,000 union members in Chicago, many of which work service sector jobs in the city, work jobs out in the suburbs, and who knows how they'll get to work that day. And that's obviously a huge human impact on this. And so I know that there's a lot of conversation around, all these reforms, all these revenues and things like that. But at the end of the day, I think we are in the business of trying to ensure that people can get to and from work safely, and can provide for their families and have that middle-class income that these incredible jobs provide.
Yeah, I think it's really important as we continue to, go through all of the technical planning work that's going to be required to reach a solution, that we keep in the foreground that, why we're doing this, and that has to do with transit workers and transit riders, in addition to all of the other important benefits transit provides to us. So let's get into the revenues a little bit more. So we saw a couple of versions of revenue packages introduced on the Senate side. During this legislative session, initially, a transit fee for tolling was introduced, but then it was swapped out for a retail delivery fee. Other revenue proposals included a regional real estate transfer tax and a TNC fee on rideshare services. There are a variety of ideas in the policy environment about how to fund transit. And Quinn, if you can throw that slide up on the screen now. For instance, in this very room, last year at Transport Chicago, you all took a poll about what you thought were the most promising promising revenues for funding transit. So just calling back to that. This is what you all thought a year ago. I will note, delivery fee is not on there. So, this is how these things unfold as we continue to work on them. I'll say CMAP put forward a different set of revenue strategies in the plan of action for regional transit that we continue to think are valuable and plan to discuss with people through the summer. But, in the end of the day, we're going to all have to come to an agreement about what these sources are. So can we talk about what actually ended up on the table? Why did these revenues rise to the top, and are they sufficient to address the funding challenges in front of us? And then again, I'll ask Maulik to start.
It's on, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll say that, as Elizabeth said, that some of these things are not on the list, but 9 and 10 are. So what we think is less important is on the list, but I mean, from RTA's perspective, we'll take the money to avoid the situation. But I'll mention that a version of MFT is in there because there is the interest on the road fund is in there, and I think it's sort of a little bit of a minutia for folks who are not sort of in this space. It's a really good starting point towards a good policy of flexing highway or IDOT funding towards transit. I think one of us Audrey already brought up IDOT could play a bigger role here, and I think the starting point is money. But the other important thing is that's one of the sources that at least I believe, and I'm not a lawyer, but could flow faster because it's basically money that's sitting in a fund and collecting interest. And if the General Assembly came back and passed that, we think that could potentially flow sooner than some of the new sources that are being discussed. Our big thing was putting out, as you probably saw, our chairman put out a statement. We wrote for him that on the first round, between, I believe, Wednesday and Saturday, on the first round, that there was all these bells and whistles being funded, which are really important. My team right there is very excited about TOD, and I told them, there's no money, stop talking about TOD right now until we have money for operations. But we are ready to implement some of these reforms. They're super exciting. But the first round had a lot more money for some of these other items than for transit operations for the fiscal cliff. There was only less than half. Then the second round, as Audrey was describing on Saturday, the delivery fee was really driving the amount of money that would go into the fiscal cliff. I'll just point out that we will work with CMAP and others to sort of look at, and I know you're looking at sort of independent analysis, because again, this was all happening in the span of 24 hours. We were sitting there trying to verify numbers to see if it can actually generate the funding, because one thing I'll mention is not to repeat the 07-08 experience of sort of passing a bill with projections that were pretty high. A recession came a year after, so it's not totally about projections. What led to the 2010 CTA bus service cut of 17% was sort of, we got a deal done in 08, everything happened, there were revenue sources, the projections didn't pan out to match the costs that would be coming. And Kate will talk more about this, the brunt fell on inequitably on the city of Chicago and CTA to balance the budgets, because legally we have to balance the budgets. And the state is not expecting us to keep coming back every year. They were very clear. We spent a few days in Springfield. They want to find a long-term solution. So let's find the right solution. So I have some concerns around the delivery fee estimates and what it could generate, and we'll work to sort of provide some analysis there over the next several weeks to make sure that whatever sources end up there are able to generate the funding needed for a long-term solution.
Yeah, thank you. So I kind of want to start with where a few things. One, I think that everyone in this room can agree that we all want the same thing, which was a fully funded transit system with a new sustainable dedicated revenue stream. And that has been a kind of core principle of our coalition from the very beginning. I want to note that I believe the road fund interest is primarily going to capital. If not, that's an oversight that needs to be corrected, but that should be only dedicated to capital. And then, as Elizabeth, as you mentioned, the tollway I think was included in the original package, as well as some funding that was for public transit in the collar counties that took off basically every suburban legislator. That was not politically feasible to continue down that path and down that trajectory. And in addition, I think, as Maulik noted, I think it only dedicated around $600 million in that proposal towards operations, which obviously is not enough to fill the cliff. From the very beginning of this, Labor and I believe CMAP, we kind of had, took support of the proposal that came out there on the expansion of the sales tax to services, which would have been kind of a one hit to the system, able to fund it entirely. The General Assembly very much so had other ideas and did not want to take on that proposal. And so we kind of, I think around late April, we realized, or early May, realized, okay, this is not politically feasible for us. Let's, revert paths. The climate impact fee or the delivery fee, from what I believe the COGFA analysis from the state was, is that it would generate $1.1 billion towards operations. I want to note, though, that part of this bill and part of what Labor supports in this bill is that it offers a statewide perspective. Obviously Chicagoland area is getting hit with this fiscal cliff, but downstate transit also needs, they also need revenue as well and are kind of hitting a similar point. So with the revenue from the delivery fee, just about $900 million would be going towards operations in the Chicagoland region, towards operations alone, with 220 going to downstate because you're generating that revenue with a statewide perspective. So it would be an 80% and a 20% split. So that's just for some background on how that delivery fee came to be. Obviously, Springfield's political. There's a lot of people that you need downstate support on legislation, and downstate, if you're generating a fee there, they should be getting their fair share of revenue funding for their transit systems. From my notes, and I know that we all need to kind of look back, that the total cost for operations, we would be generating about, with the other things, about 1.3-ish billion for operations funding, with another about 200 million going towards capital in the House Bill 3438 package, which for folks that have, worked on budget, but worked on all that sort of stuff in Springfield before, I think it's probably a lot. It's nowhere near enough, as we know, but I think a lot more than anyone was really expecting to get out of this legislative session. And the fact that the Senate passed a revenue package of about over 1.6 billion with reforms is incredible. I think that the fact that the House then later came out and said that they had actually never discussed revenue is also concerning. And I think we worked with some really incredible, leadership on the House side. I'm not trying to discredit that at all. Incredible work. This took a lot, but I think that that's where this conversation needs to go, is that this $1.67 billion towards transit in Illinois should be the baseline. It should be the floor. We've seen that the Senate can pass that. And I think that, I know we're going to talk about next steps and things like that, but that's what I think Labor is seeing right now, is that this is an incredible package and an incredible win from the Senate side that we look forward to supporting and continuing to advocate for.
Yeah, I think just reflecting on one thing you said about the House not including money, there's so many moving parts in Springfield the last week that I think there was a possibility that the reforms would be in the House bill and revenue would be in the budget. So that was another way things could have played out. So everyone was thinking about money. I will say both the Labor Coalition and the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition have been, joined at the hip, calling for $1.5 billion. We delivered a letter to every member of the General Assembly. It's unified in that, and up till the end, we're advocating for that, and that was in all of our testimony. When we think about revenue, we need to think about revenue that is going to be sustainable and growing, and that's stable. So, for example, motor fuel tax, I think we all know, is a declining source. So things like that would not be ideal choices, and that's why we didn't see that in there. We also want to think about real estate transfer tax. Also has similar, has volatility. We saw that in 2008, the real estate transfer tax didn't deliver what was expected, and so we need to be prepared for that to go up and down. We want to think about whether any revenue sources will affect behavior. So as transportation planners, we support fees that make it a little less attractive to drive and will help drive people towards using transit. That's why we see things like parking taxes and things like that. And the fee on the tollway transaction was very probably hard for people to understand, but that was intended to be not actually a toll, but not part of the whole tollway structure. And I know my colleague Thomas did a presentation about this last year at this very session about different mechanisms, but making sure that the mechanism is legally will stand up to legal challenges. So we thought about that, about not having the tolls flow, not having that be a toll that flows through the tollway waterfall, but that is actually a fee on a transaction, and that would be more legally defensible, and consulted a lot of legal counsel for that. So those are things we think about. We think about whether a source is regressive and how much it's going to hurt the average consumer. Whether package delivery fee does or not, and whether we have a human right to have our, food deliveries, that there are some questions there. I think the way that was framed is as a climate impact fee, and there is a potential there of people maybe bundling deliveries, ordering a little bit less, and then there's a nexus with transportation, with all the delivery vehicles that are in our bus lanes and our bike lanes, and maybe having, reducing traffic a little bit if people don't order things every single day of the year, and are a little more judicious about how they bundle them. So there's all these intersecting thought processes in terms of sustainability, behavior change, stability, and regressivity that I think we are thinking about. But the other thing I'll say is when a bill shows up in Springfield, there's no spreadsheet with it, right? There's no spreadsheet. So we are all after the fact now calculating how much of these things add up to, and we think that the package delivery fee is overestimated, as others have said, and so we don't think that this actually delivers 1.5 billion in operations at all. And then the other thing I would mention is that this bill has a lot of great stuff in it. That stuff costs money. So for example, transit ambassadors are new employees. They're going to be an ongoing cost to operations. Any policing that happens that is billed back to the transit authority, that's going to be a cost. And there's other smaller costs like potentially supporting dial-a-ride, adding low-income fares. Those are costs too that we need to make sure are accounted for in this balance sheet. So there's a lot of work to be done. We definitely are not happy that we did not get funding passed on May 31st. But now that we have this time, it does give us a little more time to run the numbers and know what we're dealing with.
Okay, I think we have foreshadowed the next question a little bit, but I'll try and
Rolling them into one.
Okay. Well, then it will become too much of a monologue. I think part of the question was how did these revenues rise to the top? And partly, I don't know, because I wasn't doing the hard hours in Springfield as other folks. But I will say the whole process, some of you may know, has been really hard for me to watch. I've been an annoying broken record of let's not drop reform without the spreadsheets. We need those spreadsheets years in advance to be having conversations and building the momentum for revenue. We can't wait to the last minute. We can't do ad hoc, post hoc spreadsheets about money. Money was always going to be the hardest part, and we're still trying to figure out what happened. So it's been hard for me to watch. I also want to own up, I'm in a bubble. I'm in the blue sky bubble, I'm in the academic bubble, but I'm also a public sector employee. So I'm used to thinking about how is public transit like other public goods. And we love our public goods, but we get very frustrated with them. We reinvented public housing. We reinvented public education. Now we're reinventing public transit. And maybe some of what we're really mad about is because we haven't built the momentum for those adequate funding sources. And that is difficult. And how much do we concede to how things happen in Springfield versus how we want them to happen in Springfield? I was told time and time again, trust us, the money will come. Trust us, these conversations are happening behind closed doors. Well, if that gets public transit funded for the next 10 years, okay. But do we want these conversations to be happening at the last minute behind closed doors, or do we want to build movements that build on analysis that is publicly deliberated about how we fund public goods? I am really interested in this environmental impact fee. I do think there are environmental consequences to how we've arranged it. There are also gig economy jobs. You know, for the social media crowd, the burrito taxi fee is kind of funny. And I do think there are really important exemptions to that fee, including for groceries and prescriptions. But I also think us in this room are really disconnected to people who are living really constrained, challenged lives. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the regressivity. I'm glad Frances has brought the operator perspective, but when we think about regressivity and progressivity of fees, we think in terms of aggregates, not exceptions.
Thank you. It feels like you were on the roll. Is there anything you want to add for?
I can select some more. My
well-
students have heard me enough.
Well, here, how about I'll pull a moderator's privilege, and you can maybe react, Kate, if there's something from what you thought about that you want to add. So I think I want to just reflect on a couple of important themes I'm hearing here, which is about the adequacy and sustainability of the revenues for our transit operating budget. And this has been at the heart of CMAP's effort on this the whole time, because we knew that the revenues would be what people least wanted to talk about. And so that's where we've been putting our research power, our convening power, and our effort, particularly in the 18 months since PART was sent to the General Assembly. And so when we think about what's the balance between the capital funding and the operating funding, you know, transit, the structure of transit's operating budget, it's mostly labor. And so it goes up over time, sort of tracking the labor price index, consumer price index. And we don't, you know, our agencies are currently extremely efficient, potentially in some ways too efficient, which is where some of our quality issues that people are constantly raising are bringing up. So when we think about revenues that we put on the operating budget, if they are very swingy or they don't show up some years in a recession, this can create a existential crisis. It's like a crisis waiting in the wings if we don't think about the structure right. And so to Kate's point of like, do we want to come back in 10 years, or can we create a structure that will work for the next 50 years and put us on that greater growth trajectory to have the transit system that supports the global city region that we all want and we all envision? That's what this moment is. And it's about balancing the potential co-benefits. It's about balancing regressivity. It's about, but it's also about safeguarding. And so it's really, really serious. And that's why all these folks are working so hard at it. And I think more conversation is needed, which is what's going to roll us into kind of our final question before turning to your questions. But Kate, do you, as an academic, do you have any reflections that you would want to share with us about kind of how we should be thinking about the structure of the solution that needs to be pursued? Speak on it.
I don't have a really technical answer. I would say we want a perfect mix and we can't control or foresee the future. I think many of us have had these conversations about how the ridership crash with COVID shaped where we are, but the trends preceded us. So we couldn't have predicted COVID and the severity and timeline of this particular scenario, but we could see the long-term trends. So I don't think we should only rely on one revenue source. I do think the conversation we're having is shaped by what happened with the progressive income tax in Illinois. That shapes everything. That shapes every conversation we have. Even a progressive income tax, however, of course, is subject to economic cycles and downturns. So I think a lot of sources are going to cycle together. Some mix is possible, but we don't want to duct tape and Band-Aid assortment of fees. We need large sources. One thing that was, I'm glad we're having the conversation about the expansion of sales tax to services, reflecting many stereotypes that I embody. I told a reporter, if I buy yoga pants, it's taxed, but my yoga class is not. And we know the sales tax on services has some regressivity, but it's less regressive than what we rely on now. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation, but we can't lose sight of the progressive income tax conversation, because what happens with public transit is tied to the overall state budget. And I think that landscape is going to change when the federal budget is passed. Kind of an aside that I'm really intrigued by, the digital advertising tax that got dropped. That's something that's been proposed by the Illinois Revenue Alliance, which is an interesting group of stakeholders that's looking for progressive revenue sources. But we're scrambling because of that larger landscape, and business and elites crushed the progressive income tax because they wanted to reform Illinois state government.
It's a lot there. I hope you'll be here for happy hour. I will say to stump our own work that CMAP earlier this year put out a position paper on the opportunity of modernizing the sales tax in Illinois with a group of strange bedfellows representing very different perspectives. So ILEPI, Labor Aligned Policy Group, the Civic Federation, the 125-year-old business group, the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, a left-leaning group out of Roosevelt University, and then us. And the thing was that we all agree that this is an idea whose time has come, which is not a message that everyone wants to hear, but I think the evidence is very clear, and I would encourage anyone who cares about public transit to read that paper. It is 36 pages long of hot fire. But this is the policy process, is you make a statement of what you think makes sense and could be good, and you put it out there, and that you hope people will look at it, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, and that's what rolling the rock up the hill looks like. So closing up here, as we get ready to close out the formal questions and go to the audience Q&A, I want to focus on the path ahead and maybe some hopefulness and momentum and a call to action, something that can, that people can leave this room with. What do we need to do now, between now and a special session, now and the veto session, which is really the last opportunity to solve this problem, to better understand the challenge in front of us, to align around something that makes sense, and ultimately make sure that we ensure the solvency of our transit system in calendar year 2026. Okay, Maulik.
I'll just say that a lot of things were said here, that it's nice that it's coming from outside of the transit agencies, the support that we need, because we have said all of the same things, but it can look self-serving in some ways, that we're just trying to close our own budgets and things like that. So it's super helpful to have this community working with us to get this done. I do think, to your point, Elizabeth, there's an opportunity to learn from what happened and fix even some things on governance that we are the four agencies are best positioned to tell you what can and cannot be delivered appropriately, whether it's timing, whether the way some things are set up. We know the RTA Act better than most people because we have to deal with it every day. And there are things in here that we have been commenting on that I think are worth fixing, even if, the larger structure of reform looks closer to where it is. There are a few things that could be done there. And on the funding side, I think it's time to say funding and reform, like bring funding to the first letter that is said by everybody. We have our call to action. On our side, we need to make sure we deliver the service we are promising. We need to focus on the riders even more than we have been improving service in the last couple of years. And I frankly believe some of the frustration that I think, Kate, you talked about would be a lot lower if the last couple of years had seen a different trajectory on the service we provided. So I think that is like our job, RTA, like we're very focused on looking at every possible way to make that happen with CT, Metro, and PACE and behave in that sense that riders deserve that, our workers deserve that. And then funding, and reform will come with it. So that's the direction to go in. I agree that we have this opportunity to get this done in special session or veto, anything beyond that. And even that will have its damaging consequences, but we can hopefully contain them. We would love to be in a place where no warn notices have to go out, but at this point we can't say that because there is no actual cliff dollar on the table. So that is the unfortunate part.
When thinking about where we go from here, as legislative director, my mind obviously immediately goes to Springfield and what the next legislative session will look like and how we can do these things. But I think that, with the incredible reforms that have happened and things like that, we do have momentum that we're seeing in the press, in the media. This issue, I think the fact that we were able to kind of highlight it enough that it was number 2 under the budget for Springfield to take up is pretty incredible, and that momentum has continued. I think people understand the real consequences of what's going on if we do not take action and fund our systems. I think that from a labor perspective, we've worked very hard on reforms, and we're very, pleased and happy that we got to a place where we have many agreed reforms there. Obviously, there's always cleanup things that need to be done, but that, I think, in our perspective, that book is more or less shut, and we really need to focus on the funding. We've said from the beginning that we need a new, sustainable, dedicated revenue fund that will fund our public transit systems in perpetuity without impacting the other funding mechanisms and other components of transit that are relied on. And so I know that things have been brought up around, diverting funds, things like that. We want to make sure that we can have both. We want to make sure that we have good roads and bridges and good infrastructure for our transit systems to use and operate, and incredible dedicated revenue that can be done to make sure that we have a system that is fully funded for the future. There have been many proposals out there. As Elizabeth noted, there's one that labor fully supported. The timing didn't make sense politically, despite many of our best efforts. So I think we're going to continue that fight. We have to. There's no other alternative. And so I think that just the general call to action is, let's pass this bill, let's get funding done, and let's turn this page and make sure that we are having a dedicated revenue stream in the future.
Yeah, I would agree that there's large amount of agreement on the governance parts by legislators, by advocates, and so that discussion can be mostly closed, and that allows space for us to focus on the funding. I think advocates and organizers have been focused right now on thanking the senators who did vote for this. A lot of this really is political, and people worry about big revenue votes and how that affects the next election. And so showing them that we support them and will be, the public is behind these votes, getting the public to support taxing ourselves for transit, that's what we need to do. I think a lot of people are amazingly, just waking up to the severity of this, a lot of the public. And we need to leverage their outrage to continue to put pressure on legislators to solve this, and the governor, everybody, all our leadership. In the end, I'm optimistic that this will get solved. It can't not get solved. And I think our leaders know that. And we have a lot of great champions at the table. It's just the mechanics of the way things go down in Springfield is ridiculous. And that's partly what we're dealing with. I mean, Kate made comments about, like, we need spreadsheets 2 years in advance. Well, the reason they just dropped the budget at 5 p.m., it's 8 hours left, is so that no one can, everyone's backed up against the wall to vote yes for it. And like, that's the model that we have now, and that's what the model we had for our transit funding as well. And so I don't know if it'll be different in a veto session, but that's the reality. And we just need to all keep doing the work, keep doing what we're doing.
Thank you. I like what Audrey said about tax us for transit. We have to shift the narrative and say, it doesn't matter if you ride the CTA. It doesn't matter if you live in Naperville. It doesn't matter if you never use the system. There are collective benefits, and we all have something at stake. So we have to push back on the narrative of, I shouldn't pay because I don't ride Metra. So we have to really change that narrative of our shared stake in this public good. And I also think we have to acknowledge there's been some transit problems, but acknowledge that we've never funded transit the way it should have been. Nicholas Bloom out of New York City wrote a powerful piece in Cranes. He wrote a book. We have never funded transit, especially the CTA, carrying more than 80% of the region's riders and receiving less than 50% of the budget. So some of our frustrations are legit leadership problems, legit political will problems, but we've never had the funding, whether in education or transit, to deliver goods the way our region deserves it. So I think we have some different messages for different audiences. I'll concede that. Different roles for different folks, but collectively we need to invest for the good of all, and we should never lose sight of folks who are experiencing the system as operators and folks who most rely on it. I had a powerful interview I cited last year of someone who used the word shamble to talk about what would happen and how they wouldn't be able to keep their job. So let that guide us. And I'm sorry I didn't give you props for your excellent work on sales tax modernization.
Yes, I will take that. Thank you. I guess before we turn to audience questions, does anybody have just quick ideas you could offer? If somebody here is feeling very inspired and passionate, are there opportunities for them to get involved with this issue this summer? I'm looking maybe at my advocacy folks here.
There are groups, so the coalition, the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, includes everyone from the Sierra Club, which has local chapters, to Illinois Environmental Law and Policy Center, to a wide variety at Better Street Chicago, which does a lot of organizing and passing out flyers and stickers on the trains. So all of those groups will be doing organizing, so if you're connected to any of them. I think right now that we're still regrouping, so like tomorrow we don't have an action alert for legislators, but we hopefully will. Active Transportation Alliance also does a lot of action alerts. Probably within a month or so, once we learn if there will be a special session. If there will be a special session, yeah, there'll be activations to contact your legislators. If your parents live in the suburbs, please talk to the suburban legislators. Or if your family lives in the suburbs, all of us urban people are deluging the urban legislators. We need more people in the suburbs to talk about the urgency of transit there.
And I just wanted to add, I just learned about the Illinois Revenue Alliance from CTU, but they're doing work on progressive revenue sources for multiple things, including transit. But if you're interested in this intersection of multiple public goods and progressive sources, that's a coalition that's out there as well.
Yeah, another opportunity from expanding sales tax to services is funding the K-12, evidence-based K-12 funding formula. So this is where all this stuff sort of comes comes together. Anyway, that's, again, for happy hour. Quinn, take us to questions.
All right,
Please
thank
be
you.
nice and understand that this is tough stuff with your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very powerful discussion. Let's give them a quick hand. All right, we've got about 10 or so minutes. I'm going to try to run around with a mic, if I can borrow one of these, and get your questions.
Get your hand up, yeah, if you have one.
So this panel, you guys mostly talked about, state funding, and of course, that's where, that's primarily where we want this to come from. Who's responsible for this now? Maybe the reality though is that the city does need to step in more and say, hey, if the state's not going to fund this, Chicago is going to be hurt most by this. I think we can all agree that. So is there, when we talk about dedicated funding, does that mean that the city has to, come to the table and say, okay, we're going to step up more, we're going to fund this if the state isn't, and, come up with their own solutions for dedicated funding?
I'll just say that we have put out a lot of analysis of peer agencies and how transit is funded. And one, I'll say city residents are paying quite a bit through sales tax, which the suburbs do too, but the rates are higher that go to transit, the RTA region already for a city of Chicago and Cook County. So they're already higher than the rates in collars. The other thing I'll say is in a peer analysis, we have seen that the direct state support to public transit in Illinois for our region is 17% of the operating budget versus, I think CMAP put that in the part report, it goes up to as much as close to 50% in Philadelphia, for example. So it's really, the focus is on state. Doesn't mean the city could come in some way, but just given their own situation and what happens across the country, I think the focus is really on the state, and the city as residents are contributing quite a bit to transit. Also, just knowing that, think of it the other way, the economic benefits. This is an investment, not a bailout. So investing, the return is very high on investments and economic activity that the state will really gain across the region. We want a regional agency, so then let's fund it like one if you're going to go in that direction.
Next question.
Other questions?
I think on the flip side of city funding, I think, and I know that you're putting very heavy emphasis on state funding, but I think in the long term there needs to be some advocacy for more aggressive funding from the federal government for public transit. We got a lot more funding from IIJA, but that was mainly focused on capital and infrastructure or capital investment projects. And so, is there any movement to say maybe there needs to be ongoing federal funding that funds the operations of transit agencies across the United States?
Yeah, I know you do that through APTA all the time, but yes. But we also don't want to tell legislators that and give them the impression that there might be some solution. Let's face it, the administration that we have now is not promoting transit. So it's unlikely right now under this current administration that that's going to happen. But yes, there are people that are working on that all the time.
Well, and the federal government hasn't provided transit operating funding since it was ended during the Reagan administration. So, could we do that again? We could, but we haven't.
Yeah, I was gonna. I'm gonna say two things. This is a labor issue. It's not surprising that operations was cut under that administration, but it is smaller communities that do still get operating from the feds, and that is the same in the state. I love that there's a downstate operating assistance program that can cover up to 50%. Let's bring that to Chicagoland. But
Yes. I'll also say that when we didn't even touch the recovery ratio conversation as part of that, that requirement is existing for 2026, which makes things much worse. So that needs to go. But also that I'm, on the capital side, worried about federal funding moving forward on capital. And if that has a state of good repair issue where we are already a legacy system, that's going to start impacting the operating budget if our tracks are not good enough. So right now, in the next few years, there could be an opposite reaction of burden shifting even more to operating if there are issues. Right now, for the rest of this federal fiscal year, the federal formula funds are fine. So I'm not, again, don't want to be starting myths around it. But over the next couple of years, that's something to worry about, actually.
Can I add one more thing? Yeah. I'm so sorry. But I think that's part of this bigger conversation of changing the narrative. It's a long-term conversation. But we have to make the case not just to our downstate neighbors that they benefit from more people riding transit, but to our friends in red states and their legislators. Even if you don't directly benefit from this pipeline, look at these collective benefits at the nation scale. So we really have to push this narrative of collective benefits. It's extremely long-term and extremely precarious.
Next question.
Looking at the sources of revenue for funding RTA and all the agencies, why haven't we looked at doing something like New York did with congestion pricing? I mean, it would look kind of weird because Chicago isn't like NYC where it sits on an island and you have other areas. I know that San Francisco's also looking at congestion pricing within their area. I would say that it would be a good source of revenue alongside with other sources of revenue. I know that one of you said that we need to look at multiple sources of revenue, not just one.
Yeah, I totally agree that that type of revenue generation is the right way to be going. My colleague Thomas is in the room. He conceived of, Thomas Bamonte, he conceived of an idea of having a congestion fee that was at a regional level. So like on the I-294, so when people would cross that as a threshold and essentially enter Cook County, the most transit-rich area of the region, there would be some type of toll. We are different. Like we don't think it would be right at this for just the city of Chicago because of the geographic differences that you mentioned. Like they do this in San Francisco on bridges, and it's like an $8 fee, and in New York City, it's like it's like a lot. And here we had a 50-cent toll transaction fee, on the tollway go down in flames because of politics. So, I mean, I think the toll transaction fee is a little bit in that vein. But we would agree with you, but we have to find a way to get this done politically. And a lot of this ends up being a city versus suburbs argument, which it's been incredibly frustrating because we keep trying to get across the message that, by the way, all the metro lines end up in Chicago. They're not suburban. There's not suburban facilities, and PACE operates in the city a lot and does all the paratransit, and CTA operates in 35 suburbs. This is a regional system we're trying to create, and we can't. We have to have regional funding sources and everyone contributing.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Let's get someone.
Hey, I think this is a question mainly for Kate, but others might have things to weigh in. So, Audrey, towards the end, you sort of indicated you feel like reforms are wrapped up, right? Like it's the funding we have to work on now, the reforms, there's good consensus, et cetera. Earlier on the panel, I heard Kate express concerns about the board makeup and the sort of control that city has. And so I'm just wondering, Kate's perspective on if the reforms are settled, right? Like how do you feel about that? And can you talk more about what you see the impacts are? And I guess for the rest of the panel, are the reforms settled? I guess is the question.
So I'm not in Springfield, and I don't have as many legislators in my phone as probably my co-panelists. I hope they're not settled. because I absolutely think we have a shared future together. And there are problems we need to address. But I see it as a larger pattern of inequity and disadvantage. Illinois punished Chicagoland with the fare box recovery ratio. The 1983 structure punished the city. Yes, it is not just a question of city and suburbs. Suburbs are increasingly diverse. We need regional coordination. But I'm hopeful that the mayor will say, actually, we need more city engagement in this issue. And I know this is an ongoing frustration that some of my co-panelists have, but I think the idea of overlapping board members is really intriguing. But I thought some of the board and agency structures of the United We Move bill actually were closer to the mark in finding this balance of representation and coordination.
All right, let's give our panel one more big round of applause.